Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema Podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle and thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com or if you're following us on the YouTube Sonic Cinema Podcast page. I'm very pleased to be joined by a filmmaker whom I talked to a few years ago with regards to one of his own films. This is actually the first time we're really going to dive deep into a film not of his, but it's one from the class of 1999 that definitely cast a pretty big shadow, to say the least, not just in its own right, but with regards to the two sequels and countless other projects that it left in its wake. It is the Wachowski's The Matrix, and I'm pleased to be joined by writer and director David Spaltro as we discuss it today. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Hey man, it's my pleasure.
So I have pretty vivid memories of when I went to go see The Matrix the first time 20 years ago. I was still in college. I met my mom actually one afternoon to go see it opening weekend, I believe, and I did not have the reaction that a lot of people had, which was just absolute shock and awe of what they just saw. And it really was a revolutionary film for a lot of American audiences. And it's funny to think that it's probably, like, I don't know, I haven't checked to see where it actually landed on the box office for that year. Feels like it's kind of in the middle of the top 10. If based on how many people were talking about it, you would think it would have been as busy as, like, The Sixth Sense or The Phantom Menace that year.
Yeah.
What were your memories of watching The Matrix the first time?
You know, it's funny. I saw it. I think I saw it like 2 weeks after it came out, and I didn't have much interest in seeing it. I mean, I thought I would maybe see it in the theater. I wasn't such a huge in the theater goer because I worked at a video store, so I'd see everything on video. And I remember the trailer. I remember the first time I saw the trailer before another film earlier that year. And I was really disinterested in it because I had been like reading about it on like those early internet film sites where they promote movies, and it sounded a lot like Johnny Mnemonic, which I was like, he's gonna do this again. This is really weird. And like the trailer had some cool moments, but I still thought like even the whoa. At first I was like, oh, this is gonna be bad. And I saw it, and I went 2 weeks after it had come out. And I remember being pleasantly surprised. I wasn't as shocked and probably like you, maybe because I had been exposed to comic books and manga and John Woo movies and things like that. So some of that stuff I thought was very well done, entertaining, wasn't so new to me. But I thought it was very well done, and I was actually surprised at how I don't even think when I saw it I realized it was the guys who did Bound, which I enjoyed because it's so different. It didn't cross my mind. So I thought it was really well done. So I think I was surprised, not so much by like what kind of movie it was, but that it was far better than I was expecting it to be.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's funny that you mentioned Johnny Mnemonic, which I didn't even think about. As a point of reference, part of the reason I feel like, to a certain extent, I kind of hate this because over the years it did cloud my judgment on the film for a while. Part of why I had a hard time really resonating with The Matrix in the same way that a lot of people did is because the ideas, the concepts, and the story beats and the story themes and stuff like that really just reminded me so much of Dark City, which had come out the year before.
Sure.
And, I would find out later that they used the same sets. They ended up on the same sets in Australia and all of that stuff. So it's that I kind of had a stick up my craw for a while with The Matrix. And I wasn't a big fan of it. And it wasn't necessarily that I wasn't as familiar with anime or manga or comic books or anything like that. Although, I mean, I wasn't really at the time. I was hardcore into John Woo films. I love John Woo by this point. But it just, like, after a really good beginning, it sort of, once it starts really going into the ideas of the Matrix and stuff like that, I kind of zoned out, and I was a little bored by it.
I mean, the first one looks like it's easy peasy compared to how meta and crazy the other ones got, which I think killed it off. But I mean, like, I think it's funny. I think the thing that actually got me into the theater was they were running some kind of it's like a TV spot where it had been doing very well, and I'd heard some buzz about it, but there was something about like, unfortunately, we can't tell you what the Matrix is. You have to go see it for yourself. And I thought that was kind of like, it was a little cutesy, but I thought I was like, all right, I'm gonna go. Because I was like, if this is, and I remember when the premise of like what the Matrix is and did, it wasn't that difficult. I mean, they play with a lot of philosophical ideas about freedom of will. I mean, and then like as the sequels and just go on, and I'm sure like their further work, like that Netflix show that I haven't seen, they explore very deep philosophical and in the weeds kind of stuff. But just for what the Matrix is, it's not. You really could just explain it in a sentence of like, it's like Terminator 2, robots took over, and in order to live, they kidnapped people and used them as batteries and kept them asleep in a regular mundane world while they fed off them, which is like, it's an original, interesting idea, but it's not. It doesn't go any deeper than that. And I always thought that was like really funny that people acted as if it was like some heightened, unexplainable plot. Where I was like, that's pretty.
I think that's part of it too. Where it's like, I remember like a Time magazine article where it's like talking about all of the inspirations with not just like pop culture, but in terms of philosophy and religion and spirituality and stuff like that. And basically, I had so many people, I had like a couple professors in college who just could not get enough of the Matrix. And it's like, and these aren't film professors either. These are music professors, but they just were like, they were just loving the Matrix left and right. And I'm like, I didn't really, I didn't feel that way. I didn't, it's like, I think you're looking a little too much into this movie than, Now, yes, there are some interesting philosophical ideas. There are some interesting science fiction ideas, but like you said, there are a lot of these ideas that we've seen before. They just put them together in a new way.
Yeah, I mean, they kind of, other than cribbing from different kinds of pop culture, action movie, comic book kind of stuff to kind of stitch together their visuals and their sound, it was sort of kind of a best of philosophy and Eastern religion and even Christianity with like a Messiah figure and like, it's funny because there is all that stuff there. And I think that, and I actually could understand why like professors might enjoy the film because I think would make it really easy to explain some of these heavier concepts to people by just showing them something. But I think the whole thing was that the actual premise of the film was a lot easier to sell, and I think that was almost kind of smart in that, like, I mean, we're long far removed, 20 years now from the Matrix in that time period that like Hollywood wanted it as bare bones. I mean, they still want it simple, but like even more so like bare bones, simple, like log line, easy.
Yeah.
And the Matrix at that time, even a simple premise of like robots took over and they use humans as batteries to keep them asleep, like that was heavy. So I think the interesting way they sold it was like, here's all these mysterious visuals, and the only way that you can figure this out, is if you take the red pill and come see this movie.
Yeah.
And I think and then once they had you in the theater, I mean, they made a much better film than I thought it was going to be. So I think that was the like. Then it was people who were spreading the buzz of like, have you seen this? This is different. This is
I definitely appreciate more than I did now. I mean, I look at it sort of in the same way that I do the sequels. I do think it's better in the sequels, but I look at it in kind of the same way, where ultimately they're interesting ideas, but it's fundamentally kind of a big, dumb Hollywood action movie.
Sure.
And there's nothing wrong with that. There's
No.
nothing wrong with that whatsoever. It's like, I think one of the things that really bugged me for so long, I mean, still kind of bugs me, but not as much, is just the whole idea that, oh, this is the new Star Wars. And so we were, at the time, we were also 2 months away from the Phantom Menace coming out. And, you know, it's not necessarily the fact that this is the new Star Wars, the connection to Star Wars, and given how much I love Star Wars, that bugged me. It's this whole idea that, oh, this is the new movie that you're supposed to appreciate. And it's like, yeah, I don't though.
Yeah, I feel like, like, even as the new Star Wars trilogy and even the most recent Star Wars trilogy and films have come out, I feel like 20 years on from the original Star Wars, like especially back then, I feel like everything was trying, they were trying to market as the next Star Wars because the 20th anniversary fandom had gotten so big again, like of the old films, and because of the upcoming films, everybody wanted the Lord of the Rings was the next Star Wars, Harry Potter was the next Star Wars, like, and these films ended up being their own, you know, and they're still making sequels to them now, but like which is great, you know, but yeah, I think a lot of that was also just trying to make it as if like this new, you know, other than being franchise hungry back when they didn't have a lot of franchises as we do now. I think that was their big thing, you know.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that kind of struck me about this film, and I mean, I think part of the thing that kind of bugs me about the philosophical bent on that the film goes on is that so much of what Morpheus is saying, or what the Oracle is saying to Neo, it's like profundity. It's basically fortune cookie wisdom. I mean, it's not necessarily overly deep, but I feel like for some reason, because of the fact that it was Lawrence Fishburne saying it, that you know, a lot of people were like, yeah, this is really profound. No, it's not.
No, he sold the hell out of it. That entire, I'll say this, that the one, I think, and maybe probably one of the more underrated aspects, because now you can't even conceive of it any other way, is how well cast that film was. Every single part, the villains, like the supporting parts, Joey Pant, you know, like all these people fit those roles so well that you almost take it for granted about how much that probably aided the film. I mean, I one of the things I read about in rewatching this film and just some like articles that have come out was like the idea that Will Smith was pitched this, and it was going to be,
which I remember hearing years ago. Of course he would have been, because I mean, he was coming off of Independence Day, he was coming off of Men in Black, he was one of the biggest, he was becoming one of the biggest stars in Hollywood at the time.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, you know, Keanu Reeves gets a lot of crap, especially in like the 90s and stuff like that, as far as his screen persona, but I will always defend him in like this and Speed. Because
absolutely,
because I feel like both of those movies basically play into his strengths as an actor, his strengths as a performer, and as an on-screen presence. And this really does. There's not a lot of real emoting, but at the same time, you get some feeling behind him. And
I mean,
that's one of the things that I really love about this role for him.
Absolutely. I mean, Keanu Reeves, other than Speed, was like the first Gen X action hero. Do you know what I mean? Like everything before that was sort of like good old, either like you had the muscle-bound 80s guys or like from that different generation, but never has an actor more personified not knowing who or where he is, but with a purpose than Keanu Reeves. Like I made fun of that in the trailer, that he has that big whoa moment because, you know, the Bill and Ted will haunt him forever, but it's true. It's like he's so is that person that you would imagine being in a situation beyond his comprehension,
Mm-hmm.
and genuinely gives himself up to it. Whereas, I think that the little blurb I read about Will Smith when they've asked him years later, like, do you regret doing that, not taking the film? And he's like, well, clearly I was wrong about how big a hit it would be, but I don't think I could have done it I think it all worked out for the best, which is probably true.
Well,
but I think
it would have been a different movie. It would have been a completely different movie if Will Smith had done it.
Oh, absolutely. But he even fessed up to like, well, I didn't understand it, and it's one of those things again where like I don't get people who don't. It's such and I feel like part of it is because it's cast in this whole like beyond words meta philosophical kind of veil, but it's a very simple like premise. So I always when people talk about, well, I wasn't sure about it because I just couldn't understand it. I'm like, it's a very simple. It's I mean it's the hero story of every other movie with a very simple premise. Like
and the Wachowskis, this is really, I think this is my first time really bringing them up on the podcast. But I mean, I've talked about, I've actually, if you go back on Sonic Cinema, you can find a commentary that friends of mine and I did on The Matrix. So, I mean, I've talked about this movie before, but I haven't. It's funny because of the fact that like I didn't really become a Wachowski fan until later. Until actually like Speed Racer, I think was the first movie of theirs that I really appreciated. And then I went back, I watched the Matrix trilogy, and it's like, yeah, okay, I appreciate what they're doing. I rewatched Bound, which I liked a lot more. And then, like, basically, with Cloud Atlas, and then even Jupiter Ascending, which is bonkers and not very good, you can see their very specific voice as all of those. And that's one of the things that is so great about them as filmmakers.
Yeah, they definitely. I mean, that is the one thing that particularly with the Matrix is even for you and I who maybe weren't that unfamiliar with some of the visuals that they've used and how breathtaking they 6-7 months later toss a stone and you couldn't see a commercial or another film that wasn't doing the like where I think that almost kind of hurt the film later on because I give it it's the Pulp Fiction thing or the Tarantino thing rather, where like then you have this entire second wave of like inferior, just doing all the beat notes, where like the thing that was so cool and innovative has died, and the sequels didn't do so well. So it's strange. It's like you can have that weird backlash effect. But yeah, I mean they changed the game for a very long time in a very specific way. Mm-hmm. But I think it was because you're doing a longer form on 1999, and I've been reading a lot now that it's 20 years about like what a crazy, insanely great year that was for different films and styles breaking the mold. But that was an interesting way to kind of start it with like The Matrix.
Well, and it's interesting because of the fact that it's like that is a really, and that's just that few years with The Matrix and the sequels and stuff like that. That's a very weird year that's a very weird time of frame for action movies.
Yes.
Because, throughout the 80s, you had the big muscled megastars. You had Sylvester Stallone, Arnold Schwarzenegger, all of that. The 90s, you had a lot of that for, like, the first half of it, and then it basically gave way to visual effects-driven blockbusters because of the fact that CGI caught up. You had Jurassic Park, you had Twister, Independence Day, all of that. So you went to more high concept. This feels like it's trying to combine those two with, oh, by the way, we're also going to throw Hong Kong action movies in there.
Yeah.
And that type of style. And yeah, you're right. Like there was you can throw a stone in a theater without hitting another theater showing a movie with wire effects for a while, it felt like. And then you had the inevitable parody with Scary Movie, And then you had another movie that just really raised the bar for it again with Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting to think about when you look at the so much of the visual effects in the Matrix are they're pretty invisible, actually. Like, the biggest effects that most people remember are obviously the bolt time, as well as the wire effects for the wire action.
Right.
And but at the same time, they do such a great job with Bill Pope and the production designers of creating this world. And it's a very artificial world, and it's something where it's like, once you see it, it's like, yeah, I kind of understand. You can see as the film is going, it's like, yeah, you can kind of see where this is headed and why it's headed in the direction it is. But I will say, it's like watching you watch the movie now, and it's like I think it does a decent job of building a virtual reality and a virtual reality in terms of storytelling, and I think it does it about as well as I think any film has ever done it.
Yeah, and I think it had the benefit of being released at a time where the internet was really starting to come of age, and and the like just certain concepts of like hacking and like as dopey as they're even probably portrayed in that film at the time. It's sort of it was something people could more readily ingest and understand, and kind of like influenced a lot of stuff after that in that regard. But just in terms of like storytelling too, I think one of the benefits that film has at the time period it was released is, like you were saying, like some of the visual effects are almost invisible, is that they make them count. It's not so much a CGI fest, and a lot of it is practical. It was that perfect blend that I think a lot of films, especially today, when 90% of the film is put together in post with like multiple companies in different continents, basically animating it like a video game, competing with video games. This still puts you as a person in it because you see the people doing the stunts. They did the work. I think some of the guys that the stunt people that worked on this are now directing and working with Reeves on John Wick and stuff like that. And that's still like the reason I think those films are so successful with no CGI or minimal CGI is because you can't really practical effects and stunts and real things always just there's just an innate, it just feels real, like you really and I think that this film was like that perfect blend of like trying new visual concepts and new technology they built the same way James Cameron would do for some of his films, and at the same time grounding it in a very human basic story where you don't feel removed from the character even when they're doing some very like supernatural things.
Yeah, and I will say though, it's like I think part of the thing that I had a problem with the first time I saw it was it felt like it was hard to really feel the stakes in the story, and especially something like the lobby shootout at the end, where it's like, oh hey, we're gonna shoot all of these bullets at you, and basically like the bad guys are just like they're bad guys in a video game, where it's like you're just shooting them off and stuff like that. You don't feel like those are actual people, and I think that's sort of one of the issues the film has sometimes when it comes to the action.
Yeah, it's interesting too because now that you said that, I'm kind of remembering maybe like 2 days after I did see it, which I think was like 2 weeks after it came out. Around this time period was the Columbine shooting and how much they tied that into it with, the trench coats and the guns. And I think they would, every time they did a news story about it, they showed clips. And it's interesting because there is this sort of hyper kinetic, violent, a lot of gun work, but it is sort of bloodless, and which is I guess appropriate for the artificial side of it, and also, to keep it with a realistic rating for a studio, Warner Brothers studio film.
I mean,
but
it's still an R-rated film.
Yeah.
It's not like it was a PG-13. It was rated R.
It was rated R. I did not know that.
Yeah. So I mean, but no, you brought up Columbine. Yeah, I mean, and I'm somebody who works like I've always felt like the people who try to conflate violent movies, violent video games, and stuff like that with violent actions I feel like that argument is inherently ridiculous. I've always felt that way. But I mean, I remember that being a big flashpoint because of the fact that this had just come out, and the killers at Columbine wore trench coats, and Neo, Trinity are wearing trench coats in here, and it's like, oh, look at this. It's like, yeah, you're reaching a little bit. You're just and it was an easy. I feel like it was a convenient reference for people to make at that time when they were making that argument, because it had just come out. Not only had it just come out, but it had become a massive cultural phenomenon.
Yes, and I think particularly for the Wachowskis, they sort of, in their work, because of their sexuality and because of their ideas and philosophies, sort of always were sort of for the disaffected youth, the disaffected people on the outskirts, and those themes were always in their work. So I think a lot of that they also sort of tied into, because a lot of it's like, it's almost like Catcher in the Rye, where it's like everyone's a phony, and so all this stuff. And so sadly for a while, anytime someone shot somebody or did something high profile, they would find like a paper bag of that book.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it's like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? I don't think, especially considering this film came out probably 3 weeks before that atrocity happened, I don't think that was the defining thing that pushed anybody over the edge as much as there might be aspects of certain cultural things like that certain people find themselves attached to for different reasons. But I think I don't necessarily buy into that whole but I do remember it being which is one of those things where I wonder if that also is as part of its history, it not being as big a film as some of the other films, but having this sort of like cultural cash years later, if that was an aspect of it.
Yeah. I mean, it's like I think there are individual, it's like I talked about how I'm kind of lukewarm on the film overall, but I mean, I definitely, I know when I watched it a few weeks ago to prepare for this podcast, there were scenes that, some of them were scenes that I have always loved, that I always thought were fantastic. I think the scene where Neo wakes up in the farm, in the battery farm that the machines have humanity in, I still think that's one of the most amazing images I think science fiction has given us in terms of films for the past 20 years. I think it's a remarkable sequence, and I love the scene near the end with Agent Smith interrogating Morpheus, where we really get insight into how the machines view humanity.
Yeah.
I mean, there are moments like that where it's like the storytelling is just as strong as you want it to be. I mean, there are also times where it's like it's just a big action movie, and it's like I think that's sometimes that balance is there. I mean, I think the scene at the end where they're trying to rescue Morpheus, I think that's a decent example of that. But at least once you get past the lobby shootout, I think the lobby shootout is just, it's very perfunctory and not really that interesting to look at. I feel like because of the fact that you had the techno, I think because you had the techno music, you had the different angles, the slow motion, I mean, this is one of those movies where it's like slow motion is a tool, not shouldn't be the guiding principle with which you shoot action. I mean, even John Woo himself has forgotten that over the years. If you look at MI2 the next year, but
a lot of birds.
yeah, it's one of those things where it's like I think, especially like in the helicopter and him using the bolt and your first real time seeing him trying to dodge the bullets and stuff like that. I think those are moments where it's like the action and the narrative, and that's when the movie really kind of works. Yeah,
and I think one of the great things they did too. When they hired Yuen kill his name, Yuen Wu Ping, for the kung fu work, is that but beyond the wire work and some of the slow motion stuff, I think one of the more revolutionary things they did, and nowadays it's kind of nuts with these long takes and how they do stuff, but just doing wide, long, no edit, choppy fight scenes, which was like kind of unheard of. You'd used a lot of stuntmen, a lot of editing to kind of disguise, even if you're doing something more martial arts heavy, and they sort of, I mean that, and again, I think that's part of also what sucks you in just inherently as you're watching a film, is you're like, wow, these people are really, there's no break. You're zoned into it. This is happening in real time. And the choreography.
And that was another phenomenon happening. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I forgot that was another phenomenon at the time that was happening, where it's like you have all of these music video directors who are transitioning to film, and they're bringing that quick cut aesthetic with them.
Yeah.
And so that's doing a lot to transform action movies. And yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right as far as the action in The Matrix, where it's like it feels very different from the type of action that it doesn't just feel different than the type of action that we were seeing at the time, because of the wire work, because of the way they were using visual effects and slow motion, but the fact that it wasn't also a cut a minute. It was, or a cut a second. It's like it was letting an action sequence play out over an expanded amount of time, to where now we're sort of going back into, now we're seeing sort of a return to that, or at least there are people who are, depending on the sequence, you're seeing sort of the type of sequence you're seeing sort of a combination of those two aesthetics.
Yeah, I mean, I think nowadays you're also back to where you don't really have action directors so much, whereas and there's very few people that can really direct action as well as, like, say somebody I'm blanking on his name for a second, but he did Predator or Die Hard in the 80s. He was fantastic. Yeah, I mean, it's somebody who can just direct an action scene, and it's not about making it the biggest or most explosive or doing some crazy shot. Everything just shoots action. There are people who cannot shoot a fight nowadays. I think just because of, 90% of what we see is a Marvel Universe movie in terms of big blockbuster action kind of stuff, is that your action is sort of directed by VFX houses doing, designing sequences with the writer and the director, and then kind of like blocking it out that way months and months in advance, versus how is this organically telling a story, keeping you in? It's like, okay, so this is our VFX budget, and these are our sweet spots, and this is what we're going to do, and that's it. Whereas this is sort of like, they had a concept, they hired basically comic book artists to storyboard everything, and they organically built it. But I think a lot of what really ties it together is that you're just watching people, one, do their own stunts, which even back then I think was very kind of taboo for a variety of good reasons, and also the amount of time they took. When you read about, they do more of that now, but back then that was pretty unheard of too, because they used a lot of stunt people and it wasn't so much action heavy. It was the prep work that they did on this, to train everybody and to block these scenes out and then just shoot them, and the injuries that were occurring as people were doing stuff.
Yeah, and I mean it is one of those things where it's like, um, I'm even talking about this. It's like I'm starting to have more and more appreciation for the movie than I probably ever have, because of the fact that, I mean, yeah, it's basically one of those movies where you 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 take a concept, you build the concept, and it's like, okay, so how are we going to realize that? And I think the Wachowskis had a I think they have perfect way of doing it. I think it's I do think it's an imperfect film. I don't think it's a I don't think there are things about the movie. I do think there are still things about the movie that don't work, but ultimately, I think for the type of movie that they're trying to do, I think it's about as close to as good of a representation of that type of movie that they probably could have made at the time, and they did make when it comes to the Matrix trilogy in general.
No, I think that nails it. I think the film as a whole, quality wise, is good. It's entertaining. Like, I enjoyed it. And I think overall, though, I think one of the things is, besides the creative and financial misfires of the sequels and how much the glut of knockoff Matrixy moment kind of films that came right after it,
Mm-hmm.
I think that what's really hurt it is that it as good a film as it is, the cultural touchstone, like what it means in the annals of '99 and just in films in general, and sci-fi and action and visual effects, it can't hold that weight because it's not that good.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? As good as it is, it said more with what it inspired and what it did and opened up later on than what it actually is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's kind of where it gets like, lost in that mix. It just can't hold that weight.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it was a much, and I do think, I mean, I would say it's probably, and also it's not like you can say, oh, this was the best summer movie of the year. Well, it came out in March, so it wasn't really a summer movie. But
Yeah.
because really, if you think about the summer that happened that year, like, there really was not much of anything as far as action. There were a lot of dramas. There were a lot of, you had horror, you had comedy, you had drama, but everything basically, it's like filmmakers were scared, with the exception of The Mummy, like, which came out a couple weeks before FanMess. Like, people were afraid of trying to do an action movie the same year as the same summer Star Wars.
Yeah, and I think also '98 too was such a crap for outside of, like, I think Armageddon. A lot of films just failed.
Yeah.
Like a Lethal Weapon, like things that were dependable just didn't. So I think that they were trying to figure out but a comedy like Something About Mary did so well. So I think there was a weird transition in Hollywood too that probably helped The Matrix and also '99 as a whole be a different year because of what happened that year.
I mean, I think that the fact that it was released in March, you sort of lose its place in the year in general. Because like the first few months of the year of 1999, it's like you've got a couple of decent films. It's like you've got some cult films that have popped up, but ultimately, you were still seeing the Oscar films from the year before, and you were seeing a bunch of teen movies.
Yeah.
And that was basically about it. And then the Matrix was sort of an outlier. April really didn't have anything, if I recall. I mean, it might have. I'm sure there were like one or two films that came out at that time, but that were worth knowing. But it's like I don't really remember. And then once you get to the summer, it basically was, people talking about Star Wars. People, you had Star Wars, you had Austin Powers, you had American Pie, Eyes Wide Shut, Blair Witch Project, Sixth Sense, and it's like among many, many others. So it's sort of The Matrix was sort of in this no man's land of a release frame where it's like it doesn't really have a place in it.
But that's almost, it's funny. That's just like one more thing, though, you can almost point to in a way that it pioneered in that, like, even back then, it was, I believe, January and like September were still like the dumping grounds for studio films, that they were like, these aren't going to make money. So what's a pretty empty release place where like maybe we'll get something because there's nothing else, or it's just like no one's going to the theaters. Late March, early April wasn't that. I mean, they were just films that like, these are not blockbusters and these are not award films. So like, but we need to put them someplace. Maybe, there's like people are, there's spring break, which I think was also around the time they released The Matrix.
I think so too.
And I think that, but now, I mean, now there's no dumping ground. Now it's like pretty much you can release a film on any weekend and it's going to make 80, it has to make 80 million. But, and then the windows for release are shorter. But I think they pioneered for a while that like sort of like, the soft kickoff of the summer movie season, where you'd see some like where they didn't want to have direct competition with 2 or 3 other studio films for the 4th of July or Memorial Day weekend thing. They would put them out in August, or they'd do like March or April kind of kick for them.
Yeah. Couple of other things I definitely want to mention about the movie is I'm a big film score fan. I've been a fan of film music for I've been hardcore into film scores for about 25, 26 years. And I will say, like, I remember the soundtrack album for this being about as big as I think any soundtrack that album had come out. But I do love the Don Davis orchestral score in this.
Oh, absolutely.
I think it does such a great job of like putting you in the emotional mindset of this movie, setting up a personality for this movie musically that works within the confine which works with the more contemporary music that they were using, but also sort of stands apart from it as well.
Yeah, it feels very epic and at the same time ominous, which I thought was really interesting. Where like a lot of even when the hero, at the end when Neo is the one and has his moment and it's very like choiry and epic and orchestral, there's still that like that Matrix ominous theme of like not all is well, which I felt like it helps keep everything on edge. You know what I mean? Which I think is kind of the mindset they're hopefully going for.
Mm-hmm. And we talked about the sequels and stuff like that a little bit, and how those relative success or lack thereof. And I do want to mention the Animatrix, the series of animated short films that came out before the Matrix Reload did. And it's funny because I've always liked the Animatrix much more than the actual Matrix movies, and I think part of it is because I feel like it gets more, those short films especially get more into the philosophy and the ideas of the Matrix I think it does it in a better way than the movies do.
Oh, absolutely. I think, and this might go for the Wachowskis in general, for a lot of their work outside of maybe Bound, is that they have apparently so much to say. You know what I mean? And they get mired down in the weeds in every that they're, you look at a film like Cloud Atlas, which I enjoyed, and it goes on forever to the point where like, as much as you enjoy it and can appreciate what it is, it's like you're just so totally lost and it doesn't work. That they're almost built for the streaming formats that we have now. Like you look at the Animatrix or the Matrix. My God, if they really truly want to reboot that again and they set that up as like a streaming series of different, that would be the best, because you could explore that entire world and different characters without it being. I just don't think the movies, even over a trilogy, were enough for them to do it. I feel like they just have, because it's not so much, the first movie is the only one that really has like I don't want to say a plot, but like a setup and a story, right? With an arc.
Yeah.
The arc over the trilogy is sort of like, it sort of is like one of those those dolls where it just keeps opening up into more different things.
Yeah.
Where you're like, you're not answering any of my questions. You're now just like you're making it hard. Like now I don't know what's going on, kind of thing. Which is the opposite of probably where you'd want to go. But I think they would do so much better on like a format where they could explore that. You know?
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because it's like you feel like, especially with the Matrix Reloaded, that they didn't, they didn't necessarily have an idea for a sequel. It's like, oh, I guess we have to make a sequel now. Now I have no doubt that they did have ideas that they didn't explore, and that, but it feels like, oh, we've got to do a sequel. So now what are we gonna do? But
I don't know, like if it's the George Lucas thing where he said, like, for instance, that he had like these ideas about what he would do, but he didn't really until the last minute. I wonder how much of it was they had an initial idea for the trilogy, but because of how successful The Matrix was, and probably how much Warner Brothers was able to now give them like creative visionary leap, which happens to a lot of filmmakers, is that like, as much as you don't want a studio to interfere, and you hear nightmare stories about, especially like Fox, like taking creative people and sort of like going nuts with stuff. I think sometimes you need a little bit of that outside influence to kind of be like, to keep you grounded. And I think with them, with those sequels especially, I feel like they were just like, no, it's going to be The Matrix, on acid, like basically like 10 times 10. And they're like, dude, go do it, and it just doesn't work.
Well, and also I think because another one of the producers, in addition to Joel Silver on the original Matrix, was Barry Osborne.
Oof.
And so Barry Osborne went on to do the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And so basically Joel Silver was the point man producer of the Matrix sequels. And so you can sort of see where it's like his enthusiasm for it of basically go as big as you can,
right?
Without, the problem is it's not really grounded in anything. And I mean, I think having other producers, I mean, it's sort of like it is a little bit like what happened with sort of the prequels in a lot of people's minds, where it's like you had George Lucas basically doing his vision, but you didn't really have anybody saying, here's maybe some way you could do this better, or maybe here you didn't have a Gary Kurtz or Lawrence Kasdan, saying, here's my thoughts, here's maybe a different way to approach this, and to where it's more successful.
Yeah, and I think probably a lot of what also in the original Matrix would helped it work were probably a lot of those fights where some they won, some they lost, or more importantly, I think probably just as a filmmaker, I think what hones the first one into more of a overall story and successful film is that everything they fought and won and got to do that was different, interesting in that film, they themselves had to kind of clarify in order to win that fight.
Yeah.
Whereas later on, it's just like, no, go ahead, go do whatever. Yeah,
mm-hmm.
1,000 Mr. Smith sounds good. You know what I mean? Like yeah, let's do that. Yeah. A Keymaster, great, love it. Like, because at that point, like, do they need to justify it as much as they need to? Even if they had to explain what it was, they didn't have to go into the detail of getting it approved and whatever. At that point, they were golden. So I think just for you as an artist when you're creating it, it's not so much having somebody else temper it and add to your vision as much as it is you yourself need to make sure you know what you're talking about and not just like that moment of inspiration. Like I'm sure as a musician, you might have like, oh, that's going to sound great. And then you're like, wait, I need to figure out how I'm actually going to do this and make it work.
No, that's I mean, sometimes you need to be able to step back, or you have to be able to really decide, well, how important is this to what I'm doing? How important is it that I'm having hundreds, thousands of Agent Smiths fight Neo? How important is that? And it's like, to the overall narrative, and it's like, what am I trying to do by doing that? And I mean, I think that's something that's sort of lost in the sequels. But I would definitely agree that was probably very much a guiding force for them when it came to doing the original. Did you have any more thoughts before we wrap this up?
I did have one question that I actually wanted to ask you, because this was my experience when I rewatched it last week too in prep for this.
Okay.
I saw it in the theater. I had watched it again when it first came out on video, and then like over the years, I'm sure I saw it maybe like early on, like probably before the sequels came out. I probably saw it 2 other times. I think maybe like introducing it to someone who never saw it or just watching it. And I've seen parts of it on TV in the years, but I never actually sat and watched the whole movie again. And I didn't love the sequels, and I was never a huge Matrix fan as much as I appreciated the film and enjoyed it. So when I went back to watch it, I was really curious, one, how much I would remember of parts that aren't like so familiar that you see in, you know, ads and TV and stuff, but also just how much, like, when you watch a film over and over, and also now years have passed and I've made films, and the more you understand about filmmaking, like things you'd see that like you didn't notice the first time, right?
Yeah.
And I had the weirdest like experience, and then I watched the film, and even like the most popular scenes, like I remembered everything, and I didn't sense anything different. There was nothing that stood out to me, not necessarily in a negative way.
Yeah.
But it was really weird what a total recall of the film. Like there were no surprises. I felt like I had just seen it the day before. Like it tripped me out. Like that never really happens to me. And so I was just curious, when you watched it, I don't know how many times you've seen it, or because you're not the biggest fan either, but like, was there anything that you saw that like, did you have the same experience I had where like nothing surprised you, or was there things you're like, oh wow, I never noticed that before?
I think there, you know, I mean, there are obviously scenes that one remembers, you know, better than others.
Sure.
When you go back into a movie like this, I've only seen a handful, maybe a half dozen times or so over the years. I mean, because I only saw it once in theaters, and then I think I'd only seen it a few times more on home video or DVD or Blu-ray or what have you. I would have to, like, I don't think there was anything that really took me by surprise or I really had just completely forgotten about in terms of individual scenes or individual moments. I think most of those were pretty relatively in my memory banks. Even if I don't necessarily recall them on a certain basis, it's like, at least, you know, it's not like, oh man, I completely forgot this scene was here. Oh no, this is such a good scene. How could I forget this? It wasn't something like that. So I didn't necessarily, I don't know that I would necessarily say I had the same experience you did watching it over. I mean, I feel like this was the first time I really looked at the film. I feel like this was the first time I really just took a step back and watched the film as a critical exercise to sort of see how I feel about it critically and to sort of suss out my feelings about it in a way that, like, I could always sort of explain, oh, here's how I thought about it. And it's like, that's one thing, but it's like, what specific things do I really like about it? What specific things do I really not like about it? Most of that kind of, I think, you know, and I'm going to be doing one for Fan Mess with some friends, and it's sort of the same situation where it's like, I fundamentally feel similar to this. I feel similar to the way I did the first time I saw it now. I just have a very different appreciation for the things it does well. I think it does it better. I think it probably does it. Those things I hold in a little bit higher regard than I did in 1999. And the things I didn't do well, you know, some of them I couldn't necessarily articulate 20 years ago. I can definitely articulate those a bit more now.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that's the biggest sort of I think that was the biggest thing that I had watching it this time around. But
I mean, again, I was just so surprised by, there's so many things that things you loved you now hate, and things you or didn't age as well, and things you hated you might even love. And you as a person, like, I mean, looking at somebody who was like 16, maybe 17 when it came out, and 36 now, and watching it, and I felt same though. I felt no different watching it, but I was really taken aback by how little I was like there was no little detail. There was nothing that I could like see where like it was like just so in my head of like what this film is and was. I was really surprised.
Well, and I mean, I think regardless of whether you think the movie is good or not, I think any type of movie worth their weight, that has something significant about it, is going to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think The Matrix, even if I've never been a huge fan of The Matrix, I mean, I can at least acknowledge that much about it, in that it's something that has a unique perspective on its ideas. I don't necessarily think that perspective works. I don't necessarily think those ideas entirely work, but it's hard to get out of your head. I mean, I think that's something that I think that's something there's something to be said about a movie like that 20 years down the road. And I mean, this is part of one of the things I really wanted to do about this, where it's like, sort of see how some of these movies, how they have aged over the past 20 years, and sort of different life cycles and evolutions and stuff like that. And we've talked about a lot with The Matrix here, because that movie's life cycle, it's like people, it blew people's minds when it came out. Then it became parodied and ripped off to the point where it's like there's a little bit of a backlash. And then the sequels came out, and you had even more backlash to everything going on. And now it's at a point where it's like, it's not at the same fever pitch that was in 1999, but it's at that point where it's respected and it's admired for what it did.
Yeah.
Well, David, thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, man, it's my pleasure.
Yeah. And I know we've got a couple more that we're going to talk about for the class of 1999. And I'm definitely looking forward to those discussions with you as well.
Oh, yeah, it's a great year. I talk about any of them anytime.
I'd like to thank David Spaltro for joining me today on the Class of 1999 series of the Sonic Cinema podcast. I hope you enjoyed our conversation for The Matrix. We've got a couple more coming up for Sleepy Hollow and The Mummy, and also maybe one or two others, depending on time. Coming up, for patrons, hit me up on patreon.com/SonicCinema if you haven't already. I've got a lot of content from the Atlanta Film Festival that I've been sharing. That's basically going to be a month-long thing at this point. I got behind a few days, but I've got plenty more that I'm going to be sharing with you guys about that. So I hope you check us, as well as other content, including something I did on 1994, sort of along the lines of what I'm doing with 1999, but a bit differently because it's just me talking about that particular year. Coming up on the class of 1999, we've got a movie that was name-checked in this one, in particular when it came to The Matrix, but is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year as well, obviously, and is also another controversial science fiction adventure. So hit me up on www.sonic-cinema.com. Find me on social media. Find us at the Sonic Cinema Podcast YouTube page. And for now, this is Brian Scuttle. Thank you very much.